explicitly dismiss some of those older or more fringe theories about the decline, don't they?
They do, and that's an important point to make clear based on the material. For a while, particularly influenced by certain racialist interpretations in the early 20th century, this idea of a violent Aryan invasion horde sweeping in, conquering and destroying the Harappan civilization was quite popular.
Right, the old invasion hypothesis.
Exactly. But that theory has been pretty thoroughly debunked by modern archaeology, linguistics, and genetic studies. The evidence just doesn't support a massive, destructive invasion. The sources also dismiss the more sensationalist and, frankly, unscientific explanations, things like the decline being caused by extraterrestrials or ancient atomic bombs.
Ah, yes, the ancient aliens theories. What about the vitrification sometimes mentioned, that melted rock?
Right, the vitrification, where you find brick and stone that seems to have been melted and fused together, as if exposed to incredibly intense heat. While it's an intriguing phenomenon found at Mohenjo-Daro and a few other sites, theories attributing this to ancient atomic blasts, sometimes linked to those alien visitation ideas, are just not supported by any credible evidence. The sources point out that similar vitrification has been found at historical warfare sites in other parts of the world, like Traprain Law in Scotland, and it's generally attributed to the intense heat generated by massive fires, often associated with sacking and burning during conflict, rather than anything nuclear or extraterrestrial. Okay, so we stick to the evidence-based explanations. Climate, rivers behaving badly, trade networks falling apart, and as the Harappan culture declined and population shifted and maybe mingled with newcomers, the Vedic period begins to take shape. That's the transition, yes. The Vedic period spans roughly from 1500 down to about 500 BCE. And this period is characterized less by those huge, planned urban centers of the Harappans and more by a predominantly pastoral lifestyle, centered around the religious and philosophical traditions that were being codified in the Vedas, those foundational texts we mentioned earlier, which themselves seem to have grown out of that blending of indigenous and incoming Aryan cultures.
And this is the period where the Varna system, what we often call the caste system, really solidifies.
It is, yes. Vedic society developed a very distinct social structure, divided into four main classes, or varnas. You had the Brahmana, who were typically the priests, the scholars, the keepers of ritual knowledge. Then the Kshatriya, the warriors, rulers, administrators. Below them, the Vaishya, who were the farmers, merchants, artisans, this sort of economic engine. And finally, the Shudra, who were laborers, servants, performing essential services.
And there was also a group outside this four-part system.
Yes. The sources also mention the existence of a group, often referred to historically as Dalits, or untouchables, who were tasked with occupations considered ritually impure. However, the exact nature and the rigidity of this distinction in the very earliest Vedic antiquity is something scholars still debate. It likely evolved and hardened over time.
So was this Varna system always as rigid and birth-determined as it became known much later in history?
Probably not initially. The sources suggest that in the earlier Vedic period, the Varna system seems to have been perhaps more based on a person's aptitude, occupation, and skills, maybe allowing for some degree of mobility between the groups. But over centuries, yes, it definitely evolved into a much more rigid hierarchy. One's Varna became strictly determined by birth, with very limited possibilities for moving between classes or for intermarriage between them.
And this social structure, this hierarchy, was tied directly into their whole worldview, their religious beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. Fundamentally tied. The sources explain that this evolving social hierarchy wasn't just a social arrangement. It was seen as a reflection of a larger cosmic divine order, a belief in an eternal order governing not just human life but the entire universe, often associated with a supreme underlying divine reality. The social order was believed to be part of this larger, stable, cosmic structure. If the cosmos had an order, society should reflect it.
So this period really solidifies both the social order and the religious framework that would eventually become known as Hinduism.
Exactly. The religious beliefs and practices, which certainly existed in various forms much earlier, became systematized during the Vedic period into what adherents themselves often call Sanatana Dharma.
Sanatana Dharma, that means eternal order or eternal path, right?
That's right. The term Hinduism is actually a later term, geographically derived. It comes from the name of the Indus River Sindhu in Sanskrit, which the Persians and Greeks pronounced as Hindus, referring to the people living across or beyond the Indus. So Hinduism is sort of an external label initially, while Sanatana Dharma refers to the ancient internal understanding of the tradition as this eternal way or order.
Okay, so what's the core idea of Senate and Dharma, this eternal order?
As the sources describe it, the really fundamental tenet is this belief that there's an inherent universal order, a kind of cosmic law or purpose called dharma, that underlies all existence and all human life. The idea is that when individuals live in accordance with this order, following their own specific path and duties within that structure, they experience life in its proper harmonious state, aligned with the flow of the universe.
And the divine aspect, because looking from the outside, it often seems very polytheistic, with this huge pantheon of gods and goddesses.
It certainly appears that way, and the devotional practices often focus on specific deities. But the sources clarify that while there are countless deities in divine forms, Sanatana Dharma, at its philosophical core, is often understood as monotheistic, or perhaps more accurately, monistic or pantheistic in its understanding of ultimate reality. How so? There's a belief in one supreme, all-encompassing, ultimate divine entity known as Brahman. Brahman is understood in incredibly diverse ways, sometimes as the ultimate self within all beings, sometimes as the universe itself, the source, the sustainer, the creator of everything that is.
And one ultimate reality.
One ultimate reality. But because Brahman is considered infinite, maybe beyond full human comprehension in just a single form, it's apprehended and worshipped through its various aspects, its different energies or faces. And these manifest as the multitude of gods and goddesses we see in the Hindu pantheon, Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, Ganesha, and so on. They're seen as different expressions or windows into the one ultimate Brahman who maintains that universal order, the Dharma.
Okay. So the many gods are, in a sense, ways to connect with or understand different facets of the one ultimate reality. And this whole belief system, this cosmic order, was tied to the stability of society as it developed.
Yes, the sources definitely draw a link between this belief in a stable cosmic order reflected in the Varna system, the rituals, the Dharma, and the political consolidation that was happening during the later Vedic period. We start to see the emergence of more centralized governments, larger kingdoms taking shape, and social customs becoming more integrated across wider regions, mirroring that perceived divine order and stability.
Now, beyond the core Vedas themselves, what other major religious or literary works come out of this really foundational period?
Oh, this era saw the creation and compilation of works that remain absolute cornerstones of Indian culture and thought. Alongside the four Vedas, you have the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and especially the Upanishads. These texts comment on, interpret, and explore the philosophical depths of the Vedas. The Puranas, which are vast collections of myths, legends, genealogies, cosmology, also began to take shape during this time. And critically, the great epics, the Mahabharata, which includes the hugely influential Bhagavad Gita within it, and the Ramayana, these epics profoundly shaped Indian philosophy, ethics, storytelling, and cultural identity. While their final written forms were codified somewhat later, their origins and core narratives trace back to this Vedic period.
So the Vedic period really establishes these fundamental structures: social, religious, literary. But then around the 6th century BCE, the sources indicate a time of significant religious and philosophical, ferment, maybe even upheaval.
Absolutely. The 6th century BCE was a remarkably dynamic time, socially and intellectually. It seems to have been a period of questioning, of new ideas bubbling up. And this is the period when major figures like Vardhana Mahavira and Siddhartha Gautama emerged, offering really new perspectives that challenged some of the prevailing orthodoxies of the time.
Right, the historical founders of Jainism and Buddhism, respectively.
Exactly. Both Mahavira, who is considered the 24th Tirthankara, or great teacher of Jainism, and Siddhartha Gautama, who of course became the Buddha, the awakened one, they both developed distinct belief systems. These systems originated within that broader Indian spiritual landscape, drawing on concepts like karma and rebirth, but they also diverged significantly from the mainstream Sanatana Dharma, particularly from its emphasis on Vedic rituals and the Varna system.
What was a key difference in their teachings, according to the sources?
Well, a really key element that the sources highlight was an increased emphasis on individual effort and personal responsibility for achieving liberation, what's called moksha in Hinduism, nirvana in Buddhism, or kaivalajnana in Jainism. They stressed self-discipline, ethical conduct, and often meditation or asceticism, rather than relying solely on rituals performed by Brahmin priests or accepting one's destiny as predetermined by the Varna system one was born into. It put more onus on the individual's path.
And what about that skeptical Charvaka school you mentioned earlier? Did they also emerge around the same time?
Yes, the Charvaka school is generally associated with this same period of intense intellectual ferment in the 6th century BCE. They offered a much more radical alternative, as we touched on. essentially rejecting the supernatural altogether, denying divine authority, even questioning the validity of inference as a source of knowledge. They asserted that only direct sensory perception could give you true knowledge.
Only believe what you can see and touch.
Pretty much. And their focus was squarely on material existence and achieving pleasure in this life, as it was seen as the only life there is. It represented a really strong counterpoint to the often ascetic and metaphysical pursuits of the other emerging traditions like Buddhism and Jainism and mainstream Hinduism.
Did Charvaka last?
It didn't endure as a major organized religion or philosophy in the long run, no. But its empirical, rationalist, perhaps even hedonistic approach certainly influenced various streams of thought, including possibly contributing to later scientific and philosophical inquiries in India that valued observation and pragmatism. It shows the sheer breadth of thinking happening then.
So all these new ideas, Jainism, Buddhism, Charvaka skepticism, were flourishing alongside significant political changes happening at the same time.
Exactly. The sources definitely link these philosophical and religious shifts to the broader societal and political transformations that were occurring. This was a period of transition away from the smaller, maybe tribal units and predominantly pastoral life of the earlier Vedic age towards the growth of larger city-states and the consolidation of powerful regional kingdoms.
Like Magadha.
Particularly the kingdom of Magadha in the Ganges Valley, under ambitious and effective rulers like King Bimbisara. This whole process of state building, the emergence of larger urban centers with merchants and artisans, created a really dynamic, maybe more complex social environment. And that environment seems to have both fostered these new ideas and also challenged the older, perhaps more rigid structures and orthodox interpretations of Hinduism associated with the earlier, simpler Vedic society.
That dynamic environment, that period of change and questioning, also seems to have opened the door, perhaps, to more significant external influences coming from outside the subcontinent.
It seems so, yes. Starting also in that busy 6th century BCE, India began to interact more significantly with the large empires rising to its west. First and foremost, the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Under Cyrus the Great, the Persians extended their reach into the northwestern parts of the Indian subcontinent around 530 BCE.
Okay, the Persians arrive.
And his successor, Darius I, consolidated Persian control over regions corresponding roughly to modern-day Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan by about 520 BCE.
What was the effect of Persian rule on those areas? Did it change much?
Well, the populations in those subjugated territories became subjects of the vast Persian Empire. This meant they were likely subject to Persian laws, administrative systems, and customs to some extent. The sources also suggest this interaction probably wasn't just political. There may well have been some assimilation or exchange of religious beliefs and cultural practices between Persian and Indian cultures in those borderland regions, potentially adding another layer to the ongoing religious evolution happening within India itself.
Okay, so Persian influence in the Northwest, and then maybe the most famous external arrival in antiquity, before Islam anyway, Alexander the Great.
Yes, the Macedonian king. After conquering the mighty Persian Empire, Alexander the Great marched his armies further east into northwestern India around 330 BCE. His campaigns there were actually relatively brief in the grand scheme of things, but they were certainly impactful.
How so?
His presence brought Hellenic, that is, Greek culture, art, and ideas, into direct, forceful contact with the existing Indian cultures of the Northwest.
And this led to that unique fusion we sometimes hear about, the Greco-Buddhist culture.
Exactly that. It's a really fascinating cultural synthesis. It's most visually evident in the distinctive art style that developed in the Gandhara region, which covers parts of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan. This Gandhara art depicted the Buddha and various Buddhist narratives, but it did so using Hellenic artistic conventions. You see classical Greek drapery on the robes, realistic musculature, sometimes even Greek-looking facial features on the Buddha figures.
Wow, a Greek-style Buddha.
Yeah, it's a striking blend of artistic styles and religious themes. And this Greco-Buddhist art influenced representations of the Buddha right across Asia. So this period saw Greek influences permeate not just art, but potentially aspects of religious expression, maybe even dress and other customs, particularly in those northern regions, directly impacted by Alexander and his successors.
So these external powers, Persia and then the Greeks, they come and go, leaving their mark. But after Alexander's relatively brief incursion and departure, a really powerful indigenous empire arises from within India itself.
That's right. We see the rise of the Mauryan Empire, founded around 322 BCE, fairly shortly after Alexander's withdrawal from India. It lasted until about 185 BCE. And its founder was a remarkable figure named Chandragupta Maurya.
And he managed to consolidate power across a huge area of the north.
He did. Starting from that powerful base in Magadha, Chandragupta Maurya systematically defeated rivals and built an empire that came to encompass almost all of northern India.